When we consider an idea or proposition, we usually have one of three reactions to it. Either we cognitively assent to the proposition, that is, we agree with it or affirm the idea, or we express dissent or disagreement towards the idea, that is, we think that it is false. The third reaction is that we take a neutral position, that is, we withhold judgment as to whether or not the proposition is true or false. One reason why a neutral position might be taken is because we may not have enough information to decide whether a proposition or idea is true or false. Another reason may be that we just do not care enough about a subject to have an opinion on it, so we just take the neutral position that does not require much effort. Many believe that a neutral position should be the default or starting position when considering any idea. The idea here is that being neutral allows us to keep an open mind. By beginning our investigation from a neutral position, we maximize our chances of arriving at truth because we do not rule out anything from the start. This approach allows us to truly follow the evidence without any bias. A closed mind, on the other hand, would have already made a conclusion even before any investigation of the evidence for or against an idea. For these reasons, dogmatism or closed-mindedness are usually seen as irrational positions because they reverse the relationship between our conclusions and our reasons. Reasons or evidences are supposed to inform our conclusions, but this is not possible if we already have our minds made up about what is true. Now, all of this is fairly reasonable. Definitely, many would agree that we should withhold judgment about the truth of a matter until we have enough information and strong enough evidence to sway our judgment. The apparent rationality of this idea has led many to apply this method to the question of religion, particularly the question of the existence of God. Almost everyone thinks that the most reasonable way to approach the question of the existence of God is the neutral way. We withhold judgment and consider the evidence for both sides objectively. Dogmatism of any kind is taken as an expression of irrationalism and has no place in the arena of rational debate. This is seen quite clearly in the reaction that many unbelievers and even many Christians have when they come across a Van Tillian approach to apologetics. Van Tillians take a dogmatic approach to the question of the existence of God. They approach the question with the underlying presupposition that the Bible is absolutely true. This has made both atheists and Christians alike dismiss the approach as irrational and unworthy of serious consideration. Another instance of religious neutrality is in the tendency towards abstraction in the framing of the debate. In contemporary philosophy of religion, the views in consideration are usually quite abstract and divorced from more concrete views. The arguments are usually about whether some abstract or generalized form of theism is true. This is a way of leaving the question of the truth of specific religions open. The idea is to start with the general or abstract and fill in the details later in our philosophical investigations. But is religious neutrality really a rational position? And is dogmatism truly an admission of irrationality? How exactly should we approach the question of the existence of God? I submit that keeping an open mind is a valid approach in many cases, but that such an approach is fundamentally flawed when it comes to tackling the foundational questions such as whether or not God exists. I think religious neutrality is not only irrational, it is impossible. The argument for this is straightforward. The aim of the neutral method is open-mindedness. It wants to maintain as much as possible the possibility that any of the views in consideration are true. So it doesn't want to rule out any view from the beginning of the investigation. In this case, both the idea of the existence of God and the idea of the non-existence of God are seen as possible, and it is an unbiased examination of the evidence that will determine which one is affirmed. However, this neutral approach has an underlying assumption, and that assumption is that the question of the existence of God is an open one. The only way we can approach a question in a neutral fashion is if we treat it as an open question, as a matter that has not been decisively settled. But this assumption that the question of the existence of God has not been decisively settled rules out the existence of a God that clearly and persuasively revealed himself. If there exists a God who created the world and has absolute control over the events that occur within it, and if this God has made himself known through the world he created, then asking if this God exists would be like asking if 2 plus 2 equals 4. It would already be an answered question, and there would be no room for debate. However, if we assume that it is epistemically possible that God does not exist, we are basically assuming that God has not made himself known. If God has indeed made himself known, we would not even be able to entertain the epistemic possibility of his non-existence. Therefore, a neutral approach rules out from the very outset the existence of a self-revealing God. And a self-revealing God is exactly the type of God Christianity tells us about. This shows that religious neutrality contradicts its own fundamental principle. Religious neutrality is a myth. It pretends to be open-minded, but in truth, it takes a dogmatic stance about the non-existence of the Christian God. By applying a neutral method, we can never come to the conclusion that Christianity is true because the possibility of the truth of Christianity is ruled out from the very outset. This is the very dogmatism that is frowned upon by most so-called rational thinkers. It is impossible to be neutral with respect to the claims of Christianity. The idea of a self-revealing God forces all men to take a dogmatic stance with respect to his truth. So if dogmatism is unavoidable, how can the question of the existence of God be rationally answered? As we observed earlier, dogmatism seems to be antithetical to a rational approach. If we cannot treat the question of the existence of God as an open one, it seems that there is no room for rational deliberation. Everyone just picks a side and dogmatically defends it regardless of the evidence. Well, there is a solution to this conundrum. We are not just relegated to arbitrariness and irrationalism. When it comes to fundamental questions such as the existence of a sovereign and self-revealing God, we must adopt an indirect method. Practically speaking, this involves an internal examination of the respective views on offer. More specifically, we must examine these views in terms of their internal consistency, rationality, and their ability to provide the various preconditions of intelligible human experience. In essence, a transcendental analysis of the religious worldviews is the most rational approach to settling the question of the existence of God. In conclusion, then, religious neutrality is a myth. Neither Christians nor unbelievers can be neutral. Both sides must become epistemologically self-conscious and understand the various underlying presuppositions that they bring to the debates about religion. Only when this is understood will a more rational investigation of the truth be possible.